Ladies and gentlemen, George Talks Business is now beginning. Please hold for 45 seconds as we launch the live stream.
Welcome. I'm Chris Lineberger. I'm a professor and chair of the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis, and welcome to this session of George Talks Business. We're here to talk about a fabulous topic, a really important topic for all of us in this room, in this world, smart cities. And I'd like to also point out that CREN, the commercial real estate network here at GW, has been very instrumental in making this particular session happen. Thank you. I am pleased to meet, over the last few weeks, Gabe Galvan. And Gabe is a graduate of this fine institution. And in fact, Gabe, where he mainly spent his time here was in this very classroom. And he got his executive MBA. But he has gone on to become the executive director, one of the executive directors of the MITRE Corporation, which is a nonprofit research institution focusing on federal government problems, but working on complex problems worldwide. So, Gabe, welcome back home.
Thank you, Chris.
I'd like to ask and start off, because there are so many students here, that I'd like to ask you, they'd like to be you someday. Could you help them understand how you got there, and what did this institution do to help you get there?
Sure. So when I started my career with the IBM Corporation, did about 15 years with IBM in a variety of roles, both domestically and internationally. And I came back. I'd done some graduate work, but I never got to finish it years ago because of the international move.
Education's wasted on the young.
Yes. So sort of mid-career, I decided I wanted to go back and knock out a degree. And I picked the EMBA program at George Washington. It was a 22-month program at the time. And literally, myself and my cohorts, we lived here.
Right.
And it was around the 2008 financial crisis. And GW was making a specific statement about strategy and leadership, but also ethics. And that attracted me at the time.
So let's get into the topic of smart cities, as opposed to dumb cities. And what are the components of a smart city?
Sure.
How would you define it?
Well, there is no one perfect definition out there for smart cities. And certainly important things like livable cities is part of it. And it doesn't mean that all cities that are smart have to be in the high-tech realm. But today, with the preponderance of amounts of data that's out there, the tremendous amount of sensors that are being implemented, there's a conversion of both the physical city space and the data coming from the sensors. So that's an interoperability kind of collision. And so today, a lot of the smart city discussion is how can we use the data and the information coming from these sensors to improve the livability of these cities. So that's really what much of it boils down to, at least the part that I focus on.
So it almost sounds as if this is the city brain at work. Is it really a city brain?
Well, you talk about city brain, it reminded me of a Chinese example that I heard about recently, which is actually called City Brain, which is Alibaba as a company is producing a platform, an architecture that will allow solutions to solve city transportation and emergency response and issues of importance for that environment to be built upon. Mm-hmm. But we are talking about clearly being better informed by information that's being produced from countless amount of data that was not available previously and organized.
So in this country, of course, the very first thing that comes up is concerns about privacy and about who owns this data. And how would you both define that as a challenge, but also how does it put us in as far as our competitiveness with, say, China, where those kind of concerns are not quite so high on their list?
So there's two major themes that I like to focus on, security and privacy. And clearly what you've touched is a lot about the privacy issue. Our norms, our culture, our rule of law, we have standards that we have to adhere to. And ourselves and a lot of our allies and others across the world want to adhere to those same types of standards. So there are some that could say that we are at a disadvantage because of those rules and those laws. But I like to think of it that we are actually in an advantaged position. Take the things that differentiate us and work with those things aggressively to become leaders. Leaders for democratic societies, leaders for rule of law, and living in an age of smart cities. So I think there's a great opportunity there for us.
So pushing back on that, though, that the Chinese have a tremendous ability to capture the information that you talk about from the sensors and that provide the sort of artificial intelligence to help make better decisions. How would you compare our advantages as a society versus the Chinese, who don't have the kind of constraints on privacy?
Well, it's similar to sort of the supply chain issues of today, where if platforms and solutions are built without restrictions, without standards, without guidelines, then what are you really buying? So buyer beware.
Right.
And I think there's an opportunity to continue to evolve our desire of what we think is correct in terms of democratic societies and rule of law and privacy, and to make that differentiation. So I think that's a huge opportunity. If you think of the European bloc, you think of the Americas, you think of many parts of Asia, there's tremendous opportunity for systems and standards and rules to engage, including when you build artificial intelligence, you're building on previous data and information and that intelligence. So you want to be starting off correctly.
So here we are in metropolitan Washington, D.C., and our research at the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis has shown that Metro D.C. is the model by which we are building this country. We have more examples of great walkable urban places and all the infrastructure, not all, but some of the infrastructure needed for a smart city, a smart place. When you look at the places here, what are these places that come to mind as great models here in Metro DC?
We're very fortunate in this area because if you think about our region, I mean, even going back decades, you had Greenbelt, Maryland built. You had Columbia, Maryland, Reston, Virginia, all sort of planned communities that you know very well from urban development. Today, a little more current, you see the build-up in Arlington, for example, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, things that are happening in Bethesda and Gaithersburg, things that are happening in Tysons Corner, which is an edge city.
Right.
And now that edge city is converting to really an important place, multiple places, right?
Yes, exactly.
Place making within that realm.
Exactly.
Tysons is about, I think, 4 square miles, roughly. And when you look at this, what's happening there and the opportunities, what a great example for the community here to look at what can be done in the conversion of what used to be a, I can't really say drivable, it was Beltway parking lot or whatever.
48 million square feet of unmitigated traffic hell.
Yes.
Yeah.
But with the right planning, with the right vision, with the right cooperation, I think you see the changes.
So Tysons was the epitome of a edge city. When that term was first coined by Joe Garreau back in the late 80s, it was really focused on Tysons. And it is the largest in the country as far as that drivable suburban kind of place. Right. So the fact that it's converting now, and of course, your company's headquarters is right within walking distance of one of the 4 new metro stations.
That's correct.
So explain how that's beginning to change and what started it.
Well, I mean, I think there was clearly there were some drivers that started it in terms of the community, the development community, the firms that are participants in something called the Tyson's Partnership. It's a great example. That organization has been around, and they've gotten stronger as a group. They've gotten support from the politicians in the region. They've gotten a tax-based support. They've been able to focus on thinking holistically, the education aspect, the job capabilities. How are we going to train the workforce? What does our workforce need? Not just degrees, but maybe graduate certificates and other types of programs. So all this was sort of the mix that started going into that Tyson's Partnership thinking. Today, you have also another initiative in the Commonwealth of Virginia called the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, CCI. Yes. Same idea. It has a driver of economic development, incubation, very important, education.
Right.
These are the pillars.
Right. So Tyson's, again, when you look at it, it's got all these challenges with all the traffic, though you can use the great real estate sales sign that says that if you lived here, you'd be home by now.
Yes.
So you wouldn't have to deal with all that traffic. But one of the things that Tyson's did right up front is to tax themselves to extend the metro rail system out to Tyson's.
Right.
What impact does that have?
It's huge. The metro rail there is also integrated into the space, as opposed to sometimes metros and rail lines are put in places that are more parallel to a highway.
Exactly.
Right? So anytime you can integrate that into the living space and make it walkable, right? It's tremendous in terms of that sort of half-mile magic distance.
Exactly.
And so I think the planning at Tyson's, we've seen the 4 stations really start taking off.
Yep.
And Tyson's is broken down into 8 actual kind of sections or regions. And every one of them are great potential.
Pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
So you talked about, of course, Arlington.
Yep.
Which, as far as the suburbs, Arlington is the model in this country for a urbanizing suburb. And they just, of course, last month, were deemed to be the location of Amazon's HQ2. From a smart cities point of view, how does what Arlington's done over the years, did that actually yield HQ2?
I think it absolutely helped that process. It always goes back to location, 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 right? Yes. But Arlington has shown itself to be thinking ahead. Years ago, decades ago, Arlington was one of the first counties in the United States working on geographic information systems and mapping. Went very far ahead versus a lot of other counties and even states did not go as aggressively as Arlington did to structuring data and understanding what they had in terms of infrastructure. So I think Arlington's done some very good things. They've done a tremendous job in the Roslyn to Ballston corridor, right? And what they've been able to do there. And you've seen the universities, GW included, all flocking to that corridor. So I think it's a combination of things, and Arlington, I think, has done very well.
Right. So let's look abroad. Okay. What are the international towns that you think really we should learn from as far as the smart city movement?
Well, there's quite a few. Obviously, there's different angles in different countries, but let me give you some examples. Everybody, of course, hears about China and the development of China. Korea is another very important nation with a lot of activity in intelligent cities. Singapore as a nation, I mean, starting since their birth, right, has been a planned, a detailed plan for what the nation would be, and they actually have a smart nation initiative, and that's proved very, very well for them in terms of combining the economic aspects, which the government doesn't really meddle in, and the research aspects, the universities and others. So they've been fortunate to continue to develop in that realm. But there's some other examples, and I think what's interesting is sometimes to look at sort of the city-states.
Right.
Singapore is a good example of that. Another interesting example is the state of Qatar. Mm-hmm. They are working on the 2022 World Cup. They have 8 stadiums that they're building. Those stadiums are being planned in such a way that they will not just be at the end of the several week event of the World Cup, empty large behemoths. Those stadiums are actually being built where several of them are going to be broken down and sort of the upper tiers shipped to lesser developed nations to have soccer fields and stadiums for them. And they will right size their infrastructure for the community to have those walk-up communities appropriately integrated with those stadiums.
That's outstanding, because when you take a look at the Bird Nest Stadium in Beijing, it's barely been used since it was built. A beautiful facility, but
Exactly.
Just a literal sunk cost.
And then you've got other catalysts like the Olympics. Those are always great catalysts. They can be painful from a physical side for nations, but I bet we're going to see some exciting things out of Tokyo 2020. And certainly they've been working and talking quite a bit about autonomy and autonomous vehicles. So I think these are things that are going to be exciting coming forward.
So let's talk about autonomous vehicles.
Okay.
AVs, of course, are on everybody's top 3 list of things to talk about as far as where our cities are going. A, how real are they? And B, when do we really think we're going to be adjusting to that in our daily lives?
Yeah, and my wife, and you must have heard my wife and I talk about this a few times, because she has a good story which basically says she thinks that the American, in the American context, driving the car is like opening a bottle of wine. You want to feel that wheel and you want to really enjoy it. And I think she's right to many respects. But I think the autonomous vehicles will see quite a bit move forward in the next decade, and it's going to be in zoned areas, clearly. And I think what we'll see is it'll be a complement to rapid transit, and it'll be, but it's clearly here. I mean, there's no shortage of investment right now to look at developing these autonomous systems, and safety is a big concern, naturally, but they're here, and they'll continue to develop.
So let's assume that 10 years from now we do have AVs in place, and let's assume that much of it's going to be driven by the Ubers and Lyfts. There's 2 potential outcomes. One is that now we can live 60 miles away and be chauffeur driven by a robot to work and work while we're being driven in, or it can assist people in living in higher densities and get rid of their cars altogether. What do you think?
I think it's the latter first. I think it's the higher densities and simplification of the life and the resources that you need in a dense urban area than the former.
Okay. So talking about the infrastructure for this AV future and for the smart city future, let's look at some of the infrastructure categories. The power grid. The power grid has been called the most complex human system ever devised in this country. And yet it's under great strain, of course, as more and more demand being placed on it, and more demand for sources of power that are renewable, not fossil fuel driven. What's the future of the power grid in this new world, in the smart city world? Are we going to bring the systems into the cities, or are we going to continue to have massive power plants?
I think you're going to have it's an evolution. I think when you think of energy, and it's not just the power grid, but it's also the water system, the sewage system, the transportation system. When you think of these systems of systems, and when you think of the technologies that are required, there is a tremendous convergence now with what we call the physical. So you hear the word also cyber physical, and the operational aspects. So what traditionally were SCADA applications and things like that in energy, this is now being more impacted by the Internet of Things. So while we have power in the micro sense, people generating their own energy from whatever sources, you still need a cohesive system that works and is secure.
Right.
And so with this great growth of devices, I mean, we're talking about billions of devices being inserted into these systems at the end of the day, you've got a lot of potential for danger and problems. So I think you have the technology aspects, whether it's robotics, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera. But you also have to think about the the consequences of not having it architected correctly, not having the right standards, not creating sort of the rules, back to the rules of law, and almost that first conversation about, what's our advantage versus another nation that may not have those same standards, and how should we look at the problem set? Well, this is where I think we can go way ahead of others as a nation by thinking about those architectures and thinking about those standards and trying to build those platforms that would be attractive for many.
So besides the transportation system and besides the power system, what's the other infrastructure category that you think really bubbles to the top as far as importance for the smart city?
Water. Water's one that I've been reading quite a bit about, and I've traveled parts of the world that have scarcity of water. I think it's a big issue. We talk about potential wars in the future being water wars. So I think that's clearly one. There's another side of this also. It just goes back to that livability, right? And lifestyle. And time is a resource, and you don't get that one back. So the idea of using data and information for movement of people in cities and urban environments for, I'm sure you've heard, or the students have heard about the stories that a lot of the traffic that happens in the urban areas is people looking for parking.
I know. In a downtown, it's about a third.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of solutions out there, point solutions in many cases, but they're solutions that cities are adopting in all sorts of cities across the world to try to help with that issue, for example. And that's what we see today. It's a lot of point solutions, but we got to think broader. We got to think more platform. We got to think, how do we integrate all this?
So a lot of that integration implies public policy. And we have these three levels of government: federal, state, and local.
Right.
What do you see as the missing parts of the public policy discussion in the future to make a smart city work? Because this is complex, a lot of little moving pieces.
It is complex, and I'd say that the best examples that come to my mind that are not just the government solutions, but when private industry takes a lead. Right. And they bring the governments with them. Case in point would be what happened in Indianapolis years ago, dealing with amateur sports and making that a mecca for amateur sports. And then they realized that wasn't going to be enough and that they needed something more sustainable. And they looked and they had a biomedicine hub, in effect, not only in Indianapolis, but in the greater Indiana region. So they were able to capitalize on that. And it's when the private sector, I think, takes a lead in some of these things. They engaged a council. It was actually a CEO council made up of a number of 50 or 60, the final number I think is about 60 company CEOs. And they invited the legislature and the political aspects to be partners as subcommittee members, but not at the helm.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of things happening, and I think that we'll see more of that private-public partnership growth and impetus to try to really have some breakthroughs. I think that these problems are so complex, and the government has so much to do as it is, that to throw this on the government without really the citizenship taking the hold of it and its community is a mistake.
You used a term that I use all the time of private-public partnerships. Normally that's phrased public-private,
right,
implying that the public sector is in the leadership role. Private-public is very forcefully saying, no, it's the private sector in partnership with the public sector, but the private sector is taking the lead. So we've seen a lot of it. I mean, Tyson's is a perfect example of that.
right.
That the property owners and the businesses said, this is not working. What are we going to do? And it was the private sector taking the lead.
And there is a very important role of government, of course, which is to create the environment for that to be able to be stimulated and to grow, whether it's issuance of bonds, tax-free zones, other things that spur and help incubate what needs to be incubated. A lot of that can be done by government's sort of fiat in terms of its abilities to move and help. It needs to be done. But you can't depend on the government. It has to be really brought by the business community.
And I think that the Amazon HQ2 is a great example of that.
Agree.
That with Amazon asking for a certain type of place, a walkable, transit-served, highly educated place. And then the private sector in the form of the Business Improvement District coming forward to then work with Arlington County, work with the city of Alexandria, work with the state of Virginia. And you know a little bit about the Innovation District that is moving forward there. Talk about how HQ2 and the Innovation District in Virginia could change everything.
Well, and Virginia's been careful because they want to make sure that while it absolutely will be, there is a heavy energy right now in Arlington and Alexandria in that area, they wanted to spur innovation across the state. So what they created this Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, CCI. When they created that, they wanted to make sure that every region of the state had play. Mm-hmm. So the idea of creating nodes. In the case of the Amazon example, of course, there'll be a lot of commercial incubation and activity in that region of Arlington, with Amazon and Virginia Tech and others associating their research activities there.
Right, with $1.5 billion innovation district as phase one.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So we're here in your former homeroom.
Yes.
What's the role of business schools in this regard, in the smart city world, in the private-public partnership world, in the future of our economy, basically?
Well, I think it's very, very big. First of all, the business school represents so many key disciplines that are all tapped when you're dealing with things like urban planning and smart cities and technology and implementation. And it's not just the business school, it's really the whole university system. Because when you're thinking of smart cities, you can think of healthcare, you can think of engineering, great schools that you have here at GW.
It's all here.
Public policy.
Exactly.
Right? So it's really about bringing all these disciplines into an interdisciplinary sort of tapestry that allows movement forward. And I think, this is a wonderful city to be in. I mean, we need Washington to be the most secure city in the world, right? Safety. We have the benefit of strong economic growth. We have the benefit of the government, and what does that bring to our mix? But we also have a benefit of what's not government, and bringing those things that are part of the environment together and understanding what your differentiation is and leveraging that. So it's really about cooperation. Right. It's hard in this region to cooperate, as you know, also because the three, sort of the district, Maryland, Virginia, and then the breakdown from that is even cities and counties and other municipalities. So there's challenges. But to the extent that you can bring these things together, a good example is what the Greater Washington Board of Trade is trying to do and their initiative of Smart Region. And the idea is, how do you get beyond the jurisdiction of a political boundary and really think about how do we learn, how do we leverage, how do we attract? So a lot of this ties back to economic development, ties back to education and capacity building of the workforce and innovation.
So let's end on the topic of Amazon, since this is the biggest economic development decision of certainly this generation. And what could it do to this federal government dominated town, or region I should say? Could it put us on a different trajectory as a region as to how we make our living, how we create the wealth of this region?
Sure. I think we've had some pretty good diversification over the last couple decades in the region.
Right.
And I think the statistics show that. But I think it can be a catalyst for more. Right. And may I say, it also could be a catalyst for thinking about what a few administrations like to do every now and then, is come and reinvent the government, right? So how do we use technology? How do we use the brain power? How do we use sort of this new approach to solving problems, complex problems, and how do we govern? And so I think that these are things that certainly will change from the influence of an Amazon in the region. But I see the mix of the DC, Maryland, Virginia community being, shifting. It's not going to be just Uncle Sam and the federal government.
Right. Gabe, thank you for coming and welcome home.
Thank you.
And
I've
this
enjoyed
is just
it very
delightful
much
to have you back in your homeroom, and your wisdom is much appreciated. I would also like to thank the audience and all of you that have joined us online, and invite you to the next session of George Talks Business next week. I'll be back again, And it'll be on the 25th at noon, not this time slot, but noon. And our guest is a very close friend of mine, Jennifer Vey, Senior Fellow and Director of the Ann and Robert Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at the Brookings Institution, where I also hang my hat. And transformative placemaking is a perfect topic to follow up on the smart city topic of tonight. It takes these technologies and puts them onto the ground. So she'll be talking about placemaking, place management, and I would have to mention that the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis offers a graduate certificate in walkable urban development and place management. So we look forward to seeing you then in person or online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the live broadcast is now ended. For a full schedule of upcoming sessions, please visit our website under News and Events. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.